The radio crackled to life just as they approached the checkpoint, and that's when Ricardo heard the words that made his blood freeze. Package secured, requesting backup for processing. The truck driver he'd paid his life savings to, the man who'd seemed like just another working-class smuggler trying to make extra money, was speaking in federal agent codes. 3 days of building trust, of sharing stories about family and dreams, of believing he'd found the perfect way to cross into California. And now Ricardo realized he was riding shotgun with law enforcement. But this wasn't a simple arrest. Agent Martinez, though Ricardo wouldn't learn his real name until much later, had bigger plans than just catching one desperate Colombian. As the truck pulled into what looked like a routine inspection area, Ricardo understood he wasn't just a captured migrant, but potential asset in a federal operation targeting the very smuggling networks he'd been trying to use. The choice Martinez would offer him was simple: help destroy the organization that had connected them, or face deportation, and the knowledge that his sister's medical bills will remain unpaid forever. 3 weeks earlier, Ricardo had been washing dishes in a Tijuana restaurant, saving every peso for crossing that would reunite him with opportunity. At 23, he'd already tried the legal route. Visa applications denied, asylum claims rejected, work permits impossible to obtain. His sister's leukemia treatment required money his family couldn't raise in Colombia's struggling economy. America wasn't just a dream for Ricardo. It was a mathematical necessity calculated in chemotherapy cycles and mounting debt. The restaurant where he worked served the kind of clientele that understood border economics. Conversations happened in whispers, business cards were passed under tables, and everyone knew someone who could arrange passage north. Ricardo had been listening to these negotiations for months, learning the vocabulary of human smuggling, understanding the prices and procedures that turned desperation into commerce. That's where he'd met Carlos, a truck driver who made regular runs between Tijuana and Los Angeles, hauling legitimate cargo for companies that didn't ask too many questions about their driver-side businesses. Carlos seemed different from the coyotes who hung around the restaurant. Older, more cautious, less flashy. He didn't make grand promises or guarantee success. He just offered a service. Hiding space in his truck for $3,000, cash up front. The arrangement felt professional rather than criminal. Carlos showed Ricardo photos of the truck's modified cargo area, explained the route through legal checkpoints, described the timing that would minimize risk. He'd been making these runs for 5 years, he claimed, with a perfect success rate. No one had ever been caught in his truck, because he understood that patience and preparation were more valuable than speed and boldness. Carlos's truck was impressive. A legitimate 18-wheeler with proper documentation, commercial plates, and cargo manifests that would satisfy any inspection. The hiding space was sophisticated, built into the trailer's refrigeration unit, with its own air supply and padding for comfort. It looked more like a smuggling operation run by engineers and criminals, which gave Ricardo confidence as $3,000 were buying competence rather than just hope. The week before departure, Carlos had been methodical about preparation. He'd studied Ricardo's background, asked detailed questions about his family, his reasons for crossing, his plans in America. At the time, it seemed like due diligence, a professional smuggler learning about his cargo to ensure smooth passage. Ricardo had been grateful for the attention, impressed by Carlos's thoroughness, convinced he'd found the most competent guide possible. Their final meeting before departure took place at a truck stop outside Tijuana, where Carlos conducted what he called security briefing. He explained the route through legal ports of entry, described the documentation he'd be showing inspectors, outlined the emergency procedures if anything went wrong. The level of detail was reassuring. This wasn't some desperate improvisation, but a carefully planned operation. The night of departure, everything proceeded exactly as Carlos had described. Ricardo climbed into the hiding compartment at the designated time, settled into the padded space with water and snacks for the journey, and listened as the truck started moving toward the border. The hiding space was comfortable, well-ventilated, and equipped with a communication system that would let Carlos warn him of any problems during crossing. The first checkpoint had been routine. Ricardo heard muffled conversations as inspectors examined Carlos's documentation, checked the truck's legitimate cargo, and processed them through with bureaucratic efficiency. The hiding compartment engineering was perfect. invisible to casual inspection, silent during operation, comfortable enough for the hours-long journey to Los Angeles. During the drive through Southern California, Carlos had been chatty over the communication system, sharing observations about the landscape, asking about Ricardo's plans once they reached Los Angeles, building the kind of rapport that made long journeys pass more quickly. He seemed genuinely interested in Ricardo's story, sympathetic to his sister's medical needs, understanding about the impossible choices that drove people to risk everything for border crossings. But something had changed in Carlos's demeanor as they approached what he described as their final checkpoint before Los Angeles. His radio communications became more frequent, his vocabulary more precise, his questions about Ricardo's contacts and plans more pointed. When Ricardo mentioned the name of his cousin in Los Angeles, Carlos had asked for phone numbers, addresses, details about the family network that would help Ricardo establish himself in America. The radio transmission that revealed the truth came just as they entered what looked like a routine way station. But Carlos's voice carried authority rather than nervousness as he coordinated with other vehicles, used terminology that sounded more tactical than commercial, and referred to Ricardo as evidence rather than cargo. The careful questions about Ricardo's background hadn't been friendly conversation, but intelligence gathering for a federal case. Agent Martinez, Ricardo learned his real name during the processing that followed, was part of a long-term undercover operation targeting smuggling networks between Mexico and California. He'd spent 2 years building credibility in Tijuana's underground economy, establishing relationships with the kinds of people who connected migrants with transportation, developing a reputation that had eventually brought Ricardo to his truck. The operation was more sophisticated than simple arrest and deportation. Federal agencies had learned that catching individual migrants did little to disrupt the larger networks that enabled human smuggling. Instead, they were building cases against the organizers, the financiers, the infrastructure that made border crossing possible for thousands of people. Ricardo's crossing was just one thread in a web they were trying to map completely. The choice Martinez offered Ricardo was brutal in its clarity. Cooperate with the investigation by providing information about his contacts in Tijuana, his family's financial arrangements, his planned activities in Los Angeles, and receive protected status as a material witness. Refuse to cooperate and face immediate deportation, criminal charges for illegal entry, and permanent bars to future immigration that would make helping his sister impossible forever. Ricardo's cooperation began with a debriefing that lasted 18 hours. Agents wanted to know everything about his journey from Colombia to Tijuana, every person who'd helped him, every conversation about crossing plans, every detail about the networks that connected desperate people with dangerous opportunities. The questions were methodical, professional, designed to build a comprehensive picture of how human smuggling actually worked. The information Ricardo provided helped agents identify other operators in Tijuana's smuggling economy. The restaurant where he'd worked became a surveillance target. The people who connected him with Carlos were investigated for links to larger organizations. His sister's medical records were examined to verify his motivation for crossing. Nothing about his story was accepted without verification. Nothing about his cooperation was taken on trust. Living as a federal informant was its own form of imprisonment. Ricardo was housed in a safe facility, prevented from contacting his family, monitored constantly by agents who treated him as both asset and flight risk. He couldn't work, couldn't earn money, couldn't contribute to his sister's medical expenses while helping build cases against the very people who might have helped him cross legally. The psychological pressure was enormous. Ricardo was betraying people who'd shown him kindness, providing information that would destroy networks that helped families reunite, cooperating with a system that treated human desperation as a criminal enterprise. But his sister's leukemia didn't pause for moral complications, and every day of delay brought her closer to treatments they couldn't afford. Martinez visited regularly, updating Ricardo on the investigation's progress, asking follow-up questions about details that had emerged from other sources, maintaining the relationship that had begun in his truck. He seemed genuinely sympathetic to Ricardo's situation, understanding about the impossible choices that desperate people faced, professional about the information exchange that kept Ricardo useful to the federal operation. The arrests, when they finally came, were devastating to Tijuana's smuggling community. Dozens of operators were charged with human trafficking, money laundering, and conspiracy to violate immigration laws. The restaurant where Ricardo had worked was shut down. People who'd helped him were facing federal prosecution. His cooperation had provided the evidence needed to dismantle networks that had operated for years. But success with the federal operation meant failure for families who depended on those networks. Parents separated from children by border policies had lost their connections to reunion. Workers seeking economic opportunities had lost their pathways to employment. Desperate people like Ricardo had lost their options for helping families in crisis. Ricardo's status as a material witness provided temporary protection, but no permanent solution. He could remain in the United States as long as prosecutions continued, but his long-term immigration prospects remained uncertain. The same system that had recruited him as an informant couldn't guarantee him legal status once his usefulness ended. The trials that followed were complex, involving multiple defendants and dozens of charges across several jurisdictions. Ricardo testified repeatedly, describing his interactions with smuggling networks, explaining how desperate people found connections to dangerous crossings, providing the human face that helped juries understand the economics of border violation. His testimony was devastating to the defendants, but also to himself. Each court appearance reminded him that his freedom had been purchased with others' imprisonment, that his cooperation had been bought with betrayal of people who tried to help him. The legal system treated him as a hero for helping build cases against human traffickers, but he felt like a traitor to the community that had sheltered him in Tijuana. The media coverage of the trials portrayed Ricardo as a victim who became a hero, someone who'd turned his exploitation into advocacy against the criminals who'd preyed on him. But the reality was more complex. He'd traded his integrity for his sister's medical care, chosen family loyalty over community solidarity, accepted protection from the same system that criminalized his desperation. His sister's treatment was successful, paid for with victim compensation funds that were part of Ricardo's cooperation agreement. She recovered from leukemia, returned to school, built the future that had motivated Ricardo's dangerous journey north. But her health came at the cost of his connection to the immigrant community that had been his support system. Living in witness protection was isolation disguised as safety. Ricardo couldn't contact friends from his previous life, couldn't return to the restaurant job he'd enjoyed, couldn't rebuild the relationships that had made Tijuana tolerable during his months of preparation for crossing. He was free but alone, protected but disconnected from everything that had made freedom meaningful. The smuggling networks adapted to prosecutions, developed new methods, found new routes. Other truck drivers replaced Carlos. Other restaurants became meeting places. Other young men like Ricardo found themselves choosing between family needs and community loyalty. The arrests had disrupted specific operations, but hadn't eliminated the demand that drove human smuggling. Martinez continued his undercover work, developing new relationships in a reconstituted smuggling community, building cases against the people who'd replaced those Ricardo had helped arrest. The cycle continued with mechanical efficiency, desperation creating opportunity for exploitation, enforcement creating temporary disruption, adaptation creating new methods for old problems. Ricardo aged out of witness protection eventually, transitioned to a form of legal status that allowed him to work but required regular check-ins with immigration authorities. He found employment in legitimate businesses, built a quiet life far from the borders where his cooperation had been purchased, tried to forget the price he'd paid for his sister's recovery. But forgetting was impossible when every news story about immigration enforcement reminded him of his role in disrupting networks that had helped families like his. He'd survived the system that had trapped him, but survival had required becoming part of the machinery that trapped others. His American dream had been realized through cooperation with the forces that made other dreams impossible. The truck that had carried him across the border had been a trap more sophisticated than any cage. Agent Martinez had been a predator more dangerous than any criminal, using federal authority to turn desperation into cooperation, family love into betrayal, immigrant dreams into law enforcement assets. Ricardo had escaped deportation, but not the knowledge that his freedom had been built on others' imprisonment. Years later, Ricardo still wondered about the people he'd helped arrest, whether they'd served their sentences, whether they'd returned to smuggling, whether they remembered the young Colombian who testified against them. He'd kept his sister alive and achieved his goal of reaching America, but the costs have been measured in relationships destroyed and communities disrupted. The border still called to desperate people, and trucks still carried hidden cargo through checkpoints where agents might be smugglers and smugglers might be agents. Ricardo's story had become part of the cautionary tales that circulated through immigrant communities, warning about trusting anyone too completely, suspecting everyone too automatically, living in the paranoid space between necessary help and dangerous betrayal. Agent Martinez had retired from undercover work. Ricardo learned from news coverage of his commendation ceremony. He'd moved to a desk job, presumably training other agents in the psychological techniques that had turned a desperate young man into a productive informant. His success had been measured in arrests and convictions, not in the lives disrupted by his investigations. The $3,000 Ricardo had paid for crossing had purchased something more complex than simple transportation. It had bought him passage into a moral wilderness where family loyalty and community solidarity were impossible to reconcile, where survival required betraying the very people who tried to help him survive. The truck had delivered him to America, but it had also delivered him to a life where success felt like failure and safety felt like prison. Ricardo had crossed more than a border in Agent Martinez's truck. He'd crossed from victim to participant, from refugee to asset, from someone seeking help to someone providing information that prevented others from receiving help. The crossing had been successful by every practical measure, but it had cost him something that money couldn't buy back: the ability to trust his own choices and the knowledge that his survival hadn't required others' destruction. The undercover operation continued, new agents developing relationships with new networks, new desperate people finding themselves choosing between betrayal and deportation. Ricardo's cooperation had been just one thread in a larger pattern of turning victims into assets, desperation into intelligence, family love into federal evidence. The system had used his love for his sister as efficiently as any criminal had exploited his desperation, and the results had been equally devastating to communities that tried to help people like him. But his sister was alive, her cancer defeated, her future secure. In quiet moments, Ricardo told himself that this outcome justified any price, that family loyalty trumped all other considerations, that he made the only choice possible given impossible circumstances. The truck had carried him to America and carried him into moral complexity that would define the rest of his life, but it also carried him to the resources that saved the person he loved most. Sometimes, in the arithmetic of desperation, even betrayal could be a form of love,